Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to the talk on ingredient substitutions in traditional Tibetan medicine as it relates to resiliency and sustainability. I just want to say a quick thank you to the conference organizers and also my teachers of Tibetan medicine. And what I'm presenting today, I just published a couple of months ago in Human Ecology, Traditional Medicines in a Global Economy, which is part of a larger special cluster that I co-edited with Jack Hayes and Steve Harrell on resilience, rationalism, and response in modern Chinese socio-ecological systems. So I refer you to that article for more depth and detail. In Tibetan medicine and in other traditional medicines, ingredients are wild harvested. So this is plants, animals, minerals, soils, salts, all different types of materials. And the wild harvested materials are preferred. I'll talk in a few minutes about cultivation as a possible alternative to wild harvesting. But they're definitely preferred by practitioners, producers, and consumers of these medicines. There's wild harvested materials are seen as having more potency. But there are issues with this, of course, and mostly what I'll talk about today is as it relates to overproduction. But, climate change, overgrazing, overharvesting are also concerns. We are really kind of, I would say, at the beginning stages of understanding this and the sort of the big picture of this issue. We need more data. Specifically in regards to increasing production, which is linked obviously to increasing consumption, but also some changes in the industry technology within China. I'm really specifically talking about traditional medicine within China, but of course there are broader implications globally. Just to give you kind of some sense of how much increased production there is. In 2013, the Pacific Ridge Medical Report notes that since 2011, China has become the world's third largest pharmaceutical market, with a five-fold increase in industry output from 1998 to 2007. Now, of this larger pharmaceutical market, which is all pharmaceuticals, 36% is in traditional medicines. So that includes Tibetan medicine as well as Chinese medicine. So it's a fairly big chunk of the world's pharmaceutical market is in these traditional medicines. Just some figures here from the early 2000s, Tibetan medicine increased in production about almost 130%. And Chinese medicine, which in China includes Tibetan medicine as well as traditional Chinese medicine, has increased by about 15% in 5-year span from 2011 to 2016. So increased production is a major concern. Some key resources that are used in Tibetan medicine are endangered in terms of plants, but also in terms of animals. I just have a slide on here about plants because I had to reduce my slides. So, either on the red list or the CITES list, species like Aconitum, Heterophyllum, Aristocles grandiflora, and some species of Meconopsis, which you see pictured here on the left. Cultivation has an alternative to wild harvesting, and there have been trials ongoing in various regions throughout the Himalayas since, at least 10 years, probably closer to 20 years now, but there are lots of, varying results with that. One of the biggest problems is that some of the most endangered plants are the most difficult to grow. They grow in high alpine meadows like you see, well, this isn't a meadow, but high alpine contexts like you see pictured in this photograph. And some of the easiest to grow are not endangered. Like Inula racemosa, which is heavily utilized. Now, the practice of substitution in Tibetan medicine, sub in Tibetan, is the practice of using an ingredient, one ingredient for another ingredient, as the name would imply. It's encoded in medical texts, both old and new. Some of these medical texts, one of the oldest goes back to the 12th century, with probably parts that were written in the 8th century. And the substitutions are based on the concept of lobo, or essence of a substance, taste and the aftertaste, and the therapeutic effect of a substance. So in the medical text, sometimes it is stated specifically which ingredient could be used for another ingredient, or sometimes it's just, sort of alluded to or suggested that you could look for this type of plant, but doctors know that due to their training that they can look for substitutions based on things like the ngulbo, the taste, the aftertaste, the therapeutic effect. So substitutions are related to availability and cost of resources. If you are not able to find an ingredient that's specified, for example, in one of the medical texts in the formula for a medicine, you can use a substitute that's available in your area. And you may know about the substitute through the medical text itself may be explicit about this, or you may have discovered it through your own investigation or through your own training as a medical doctor. It's also related to costs of resources, so that if an ingredient is available but it's too expensive, often a choice is made to get something that's less expensive to acquire. Substitution is also really interestingly related to polysemy in Tibetan language, which I will not be able to talk about very much. I have an example I'll show you in just a little bit, but I'll just leave those couple of bullet points up there that you can read, and I talk about them a little bit more in the paper. The practice of substitution allows for fluidity in medical practice, so that there can be variability within localized lineages. There's a standardized kind of a training that many doctors receive, that traditionally received in monasteries and now are receiving in medical colleges. There is some variability there, although there's also strong pressures for standardization. But there is fluidity built into the system through the use of substitutions. So this is an adaptive and flexible practice, and that's a key, part of what we need to recognize about substitutions. So in the paper, and just briefly here, I'll just talk a little bit about the concept of panarchy and resilience, as this comes from resilience theory literature. A panarchy describes the nested hierarchies of interconnected parts of a complex system, right? So it's a model of understanding the relationships between people, plants, and ecosystems, markets, etc. And key to the concept of panarchy are adaptive cycles of rapid change and also sustained stability, right, which is termed revolt and memory in the resilience theory. And how I am thinking about substitution is as one of these sustained stability memory kind of processes. Resilience is the ability of a system to withstand disturbances, and it can exist at various levels of the panarchy, as described by Gunderson and Halling in 2002. And Sheffer et al. Identified key aspects of complex systems, including network heterogeneity and connectivity. And essentially what is important here is how adaptive capacity is related to heterogeneity, so that the more heterogeneous a system is and the nodes within the system are, the more modular those nodes are, the more likely it is to be able to adapt. In contrast, systems that are more likely to collapse, you see that kind of represented here, are systems where there is a lot of homogeneity between the nodes. And that makes it difficult for them to change, and therefore these massive collapses happen. So what I argue is that substitution has this feature of heterogeneity, and that's what I'll demonstrate in a couple of examples. So gurgum in Tibetan is an important ingredient that's generally thought of as Crocus sativus in the Iridaceae family, or saffron. But Carthamus tinctorius is often used from the Compositae family as a substitute. Crocus is quite expensive. It's difficult. It's not difficult in some places it's difficult to obtain, but through trade it's not that difficult to obtain, but it's very expensive. So it's readily substituted with this plant. So that's one example. And what I want to point out here is that these are two plants from two different plant families. altogether, which I think is a good example of heterogeneity. And then an even more elaborate example of heterogeneity is latsi in Tibetan muscus, a couple different species, which is the deer musk. Musk is an important ingredient, has been traditionally. It's not being used really at all in most places now. I think it's 4 of the 6 species of this musk deer that occur in the Himalayas and in China, other parts of China, are endangered or close to endangered. So it's not an ingredient that's used very much anymore. And that's quite recently. I mean, when I started field work in Southwest China about 20 years ago, whatever it was, they were still using musk, but now they don't use it at all. But these 3 different types of plants can be used as a substitute for musk. And there's some interesting stuff linguistically here, where in Tibetan you can see latsi at the beginning of the name for the pedicularis megalantha, and also la in the beginning of the name for erodium. So anyway, the point here is, again, thinking about heterogeneity. We have plants from 3 different plant families that can be used as a substitute for an animal ingredient. And this is just, I'm just giving you a couple of examples here. There are more examples as well that I can't get to, but this is a fine example of the heterogeneity of the nodes in the system. And all of that heterogeneity is helpful for the adaptability of the system. But what we find with standardizations is that flexibility goes away, right? We talk about this as a rigidity trap. That's how it's discussed in the literature. And so standards that are put forth by the WTO, which China adheres to with good manufacturing practices and others for the production of traditional Tibetan medicines, may have some advantages in many ways, but they're also very inflexible. Adjustments in formulas are not possible, or it's very difficult to adjust formulas in the industrialized setting. So just to give you kind of an example, Tibetan recipes can have between 3 and several hundred ingredients. In one recipe that Barbara Gierke discusses, Manu Chitang, which has 4 ingredients, there can be 20 possible variations, right? 3 of the 4 ingredients are the same in the variations, but their proportions change. And then the 4th ingredient can change. Gawe Dorje, who's a practitioner himself, identified about 10,000 recipes from 20 medical texts. Right. So you see that there's a distinct flexibility in the traditional system, which is difficult to square with the standardization that's happening in the medical system. So just to finish up quickly, increased consumption and production, of course, is leading to increasing pressure on resources. The standardizations that exist in the industry form a kind of rigidity. Substitutions, the practice of ingredient substitution allows for flexibility and resilience as these pressures increase. So it should be encouraged in the industrial setting and with small-scale producers as much as possible. Thank you all for your attention.